Perfect. All right. Well, hello, everybody. I hope everyone had a wonderful Thanksgiving, and I appreciate all of you, whether you're joining me live or if you are watching this post-emptively, for joining us on this rugby high performance off-season considerations discussion here. So just before we jump into everything, I want to give you a little bit of an overview of what we'll be talking about today. So really just going to start with a little bit of background on myself, how I got here and really what my thought process is in developing this. Then we're going to jump into the why. Why does this matter in the rugby landscape right now? Why is this something that's pertinent to both men's club, women's club, and collegiate teams as well? And then dive a little bit into the flight strength conditioning program goals. Then we're going to go a little bit into what are we trying to create? What sort of adaptations are we trying to push within our players, and particularly within certain position groups that we have? Then we'll jump into what makes those particular position groups great. And I'll finish off by going over a very, very general off-season training structure, both for spring sevens as well as fall 15s and spring 15s, whatever your buildup might be going into there. If anybody has any questions along the way, or if you have any questions post-emptively and you'd like to reach out, you'll have all of my contact information towards the end. I would be more than happy to answer any questions that you have, or get into a longer discussion about this stuff, as I could chat about it all day. All right, so diving into everything here. So a little bit about me for you guys. My name's Shane Dempsey, currently a strength coach at Flight Performance and Fitness. I am an NSCA CPT, currently finishing up my CSCS as well. I would consider my specialty areas to really be energy systems development and mental performance. How do you take all of the work that you've done in the weight room, and the mentality and the mindset that you've created in the weight room, and translate that over into what you're doing on the field, and how can you use that to excel on the field? Really have developed this through both my coaching and playing experiences. I was the former director of strength and conditioning, and interim head coach at Dartmouth Rugby. And then playing, as you can see, I've had a pretty long playing career, lots of high performance stuff. And really, the big thing that's driven this for me is, as I was playing and even as I was getting into coaching, there seemed to be a disconnect really between the ways that we were preparing our athletes based on the demands that our athletes are experiencing in games. And with the development of collegiate rugby and the proliferation of a number of varsity programs and varsity teams, everything along those lines, being tactful and being very precise in how you're training your players is going to go a long way in terms of building buy-in, creating the club culture that you're looking for, and ultimately, particularly at the collegiate club level, leaving that club in a better place than you found it. So starting with why here. Again, why is this stuff important? Why do college rugby teams need to hone in a little bit more in terms of how they train? If you look particularly at the state of college rugby, there's more resources and there's a lot more competition. Throughout the country in the past 10 years, we've gotten to the point where there's 53 different varsity or quasi-varsity teams within the U.S. domestic landscape. Little personal anecdote, when I was at University of Arizona, we were a quasi-varsity team competing against the Cals, the St. Mary's, the UCLA's, all of these different places. They're varsity teams, right? They have a lot more resources. They have a lot more time available to them. So it was really important to us to be as efficient as possible with training to be able to compete with resource-laden clubs. And going back to my previous point, one thing that I think is beautiful about college and club rugby is the culture that it drives, and the culture that it leaves behind and what it creates within players. So, the big thing, even if that goal of the club is to simply create that excellent club culture, leave the club in a better place, in order to do that, you have to be able to compete. And with all of these different schools, particularly in the Northeast, within the women's varsity section, you see a lot of schools that are using rugby to bring in talent, to bring in students from international places. And this is creating a really competitive culture. The problem is some of the clubs with less resources might be left behind. So how do you bridge that gap? And it's through pretty targeted and knowledgeable training. The second point here is in terms of why is injury mitigation. We're not going to be able to eliminate all injuries. It's a fact of the game. It's going to happen. But almost all of the data shows and the studies show that strong and resilient bodies and ones that have been put under stress and required to adapt based on the stresses that they've been put under, they're going to bounce back from injury quicker and also have a less likelihood of a major injury, right? So for you clubs where you might have a few studs that are going to drive the season for you, you get to keep that top talent on the field for longer. For your players that they're just grinders and they're good because they work really hard, they get to stay on the field longer because their body's more resilient, because they can put up a little bit better of a fight for themselves, right? Third point, looking at this, is muscular strength and endurance. I can't tell you how many times I was on a team where you're batting around with a really good team for the first 40, 50, 60 or so minutes, and then guys' legs start burning, right? Their gas tank starts running out. They start huffing and puffing, and they can't recover quite as well as they used to. That to me is a direct product of the training prior that they've been put under. And again, even if you're still going to be gassed, you're still going to be tired, it's still going to be a difficult slog going through 80 minutes of a rugby match. But if you have created that mental and physical resilience through repeated bouts of work and through repeated bouts of concentrated work, then that muscular strength and endurance is going to skyrocket, and your ability to overcome that adversity within your muscles and within your energy systems and within your body is just going to follow along there. The last thing that we're looking at here, it kind of goes hand in hand with that, but that's confidence and attitude. You want to develop a hard edge. You want to develop a team and a culture that's going to go to bat for each other. One thing that just screams to me with this is if you watch the Ireland-New Zealand summer test series from this past summer, you saw an Irish team that had a hard edge. They were a team that was confident, they had attitude, and they took it to New Zealand, one of the top teams in the world, one of the best professional organizations in the world when it comes to physical and mental performance. And they took the bat to them at their home park, at Eden Park, right? And that to me comes from a team that's brimming with confidence and attitude based on the culture that they've created, based on the buy-in that they've created. So all of this kind of wraps into, we want to be able to put your club, wherever position it is, in the best place to be successful on the field. And that's by doing really targeted and concentrated strength conditioning work based on the player demands when they're off of the field and in the off season. So branching off of why here, what are my main goals and Flight's main goals for an S&C program, right? Again, I want to create injury resiliency in problem areas. If you look at the numbers, right, shoulder, hamstrings, hips and low back, and generally soft tissue, you can roll hamstrings into that soft tissue category, but that's going to be the really big problem areas for rugby players. And there's some pretty, you'll see a little bit later, there's some pretty alarming statistics, particularly when it comes to our tight five, our centers and our back rowers in terms of how their injury distribution goes along, right? Second thing I'm looking to do is really increase max strength and power capabilities. Even if I can only move the needle 1% to 2% on these guys' max strength and power capabilities, I've now given them a little bit more in the tank for them to push through. This is particularly pertinent for our props as well as our locks. When they're in the engine room, they've got to be able to absorb force and then redirect it using the strength and power that they've created for themselves. Right. The third point is going to be, I want all of my athletes to excel at any change of direction, linear or lateral acceleration concept. Now, how we apply that to the athlete is going to be a little bit different based on that position group. I'm not going to do most of the same change of direction or linear lateral accel work that I would with a wing as I would with a prop. Two different position groups, two different demands placed on them in terms of what kind of change of direction, linear or lateral acceleration they need to excel in. And then lastly, going back to the mindset for me, my biggest goal is to create strong, hard-nosed rugby players that are ready to attack, right? Ones that have put themselves through the paces, ones that are mentally resilient, and ones that are ready to put themselves forward and get stuck into the contact areas, all right? The last point on this is, here at Flight Performance Fitness, we follow what's called the SAID principle. So SAID is specific adaptations for imposed demands. Right. Looking at that, we're going to see some of the imposed demands that you see by these position groups, and generally little tweaks that we can make within their training regimen that are going to help us highlight some of the strengths as well as some of the problem areas that we have for these groups. So what exactly are we trying to create? And again, the way that I look at this, we've got 3 different position groups that we're trying to nail into here. So the first one being the rhinos. These are the type 5, right? So when you think of a rhino, what do you think of? They're large, they're durable, they're super sturdy, and they cover short distances really, really well, right? That's what I'm trying to create with my type 5, my props, my hookers, and my second rowers. Going into the second position group here, we have our back rowers and our centers, which is going to make up the horses. When you think of a horse, what do you think of? They're a thoroughbred, right? They've got great aerobic capabilities, incredibly strong, able to carry large amounts of weight for long distances, right? All of these different things. And then lastly, we have our cheetahs. So cheetahs, we're looking at our 9s and our 10s and our back 3. With all of these different position groups, right, they're going to have some specialization. If you think about a cheetah, what do? They wait, they bide their time, and then they're lightning quick and they put themselves into there. They take advantage of the opportunity that's presented, and then they go back into hiding for a little bit while the rhinos and all of the other animals of the Serengeti, bide their time and do the slow things. Right. So when I look at the position groups, these are the things that I liken them to. And this goes back to the said principle, specific adaptations to impose demands. You as a coach or as a professional probably wouldn't train or feed these 3 different animals in the same way. So why would we do that the same way with our athletes? So what makes them great? I'm looking at 2 archetypes for what I think are 2 of the best rhinos in the world right now, right? So on the left, you have Tadhg Furlong. He's one of the props for Ireland and has been for a number of years. And the same exact thing with Sam Whitelock on the right, one of the locks for New Zealand. Him and Brodie Retallick have really changed the way that people play the position over the past 10, 15 years. I think these are great archetypes for us to look at here. So what does make them great? The rhinos. They're high ground. We recently went to a seminar with Dr. Pat Davidson, and he discussed, looking at athletes in terms of how much ground do they touch during their match or during their competition athletic event. So, and ground being anything that they can put their hands on, anything that's a tangible object coming into them. So when you think about these guys, they're extremely high ground, right? Whether they're in a scrum, whether they're in, getting into a ruck battle, if there's a maul, anything that goes along those lines, they have things pushing and shoving against them. They need to be sturdy, right? And they need to be able to push away and give back all of that energy that they've just absorbed. Breaking it down a little bit further, I think there's 4 things that makes these guys great, right? With a proper lock, you want a great work rate over 50 to 80 minutes. Energy systems is going to be huge for these guys. Secondly, you want dominance in that contact area and the set piece. That's not just looking at like rucks and things like that, but with a scrum, they've got 800 pounds, 900 pounds, whatever it is, of force pressing into them, probably more, 1500 more likely, pressing into them. How do they deal with that load? How do they redirect? And then how do they win that contact battle for you? I think a very overlooked portion of things for this group is their close quarters footwork, right? So when you look at a prop and a lock, what do you want them doing in open play for you? You want front foot ball. You want to be able to start moving fast, depending on the style of play you have. Most people are going towards a faster style of play, right? But you want front foot ball. In order to get that, you need soft shoulders. So these guys have to excel at close quarters footwork and creating soft shoulders for themselves, right? And then the last thing that we're looking at here, this is going to be a theme across all of the position groups: durable. Durable. There's a workload that these guys take on. You'll see in a couple of statistics to consider in a second, but they have to be durable. Otherwise, you don't see either of these guys as the greatest at their position ever if they're not on the field half of the time. Few statistics to consider for this position group, right? So on average in a match, 45% of all of your collisions are going to be in the type 5. That's not even including scrums, mauls, and lineouts. That is simply open play, breakdowns, carries, and tackles. These guys are going to do a large amount of the physical work in the trenches for you. On the flip side of that, you really only see 335 high intensity or over 6 meters per second meters ran per match. So what that means is these guys aren't doing anything like 10, 20-meter sprints, just like we said before with the footwork and everything along those lines, they're doing quick, short, sharp bursts, right? Quick, short, sharp bursts. I need 3 meters. I need 4 meters. I need 5 meters to get myself over the gain line, right? So our training and conditioning should reflect that. There's roughly 30 to 40 set pieces per match. So not only are they doing 45% of all collisions, which means they're at about 180 split between 5 of them, but they add on 30 to 40 more set pieces or contact areas per match. Well, what this is going to do is this is going to put a lot of wear and tear on them. So again, going back to that resiliency and injury prevention, this is where we have to build up certain key problem areas. And looking at those problem areas, 52% of all of their injuries in high performance rugby, this was a French study done back in 2017, for this position group were shoulder, knee, or soft tissue related, right? So again, soft tissue, we're thinking strains, pulls, anything along those lines. And to me, a lot of times that is a direct correlation with the preseason buildup and not conditioning those tissues to be used to the elastic load and demand that's going to be placed on them. A really great example I see of this is you saw in the 2020 NFL season how many soft tissue injuries were occurring over the first 4 to 6 weeks or so, Achilles tears, ACLs, everything like that. And yeah, again, to me, that is a direct correlation with shortened preseason, inability to get athletes' muscles and tissues used to the load that's being placed on them plyometrically and with sprinting. And so then you see this massive increase in injury incidents with your athletes. Now, how does this group differ? Again, thinking about this term and concept of ground, these are high ground athletes, right? So I want them to deal with axial load, thinking back squat. I want them to be able to tolerate that on their spine and know how to deal with that weight on them. And again, I want long, slow force production, right? Their ability to create force in that back squat, very heavy loads, to be exceptional. With low, high intensity running meters in mind, they don't have to do a large amount of distance or tempo running, anything along those lines. Pepper it in, but again, thinking about problem areas for injury, hips and low back, and the amount of force that those are going to take, it's a give and take equation here where we're trying to weigh pros and cons of I can have them tempo run, but that's going to put their hips and low back in a pretty susceptible position if I'm going to have them go do some contact work later. Right, so it's a balance of those things. I like to utilize things like bear holds and quadruped positions. This really helps enhance scrum profile capabilities within their training regimens. Again, going to the COD and linear and lateral acceleration work, those are done in close quarters as well. So tip and rip drills, little outside footwork drills, just give them a cone to hop over to. Again, they don't need to be doing big steps where they're tracking in 10 to 15 meter places. They have to be able to track and do their footwork both in attack and defense within a 3 to 7 meter grid at most. High volume of anaerobic combat conditioning for these guys. Again, 45% of all collisions split between 5 guys. That's not even including scrums and lineouts. They have to be able to have repeated high intensity work bouts, but from a combat standpoint, they're not going to be sprinting. So I wouldn't have them sprint for 15 seconds on, 45 seconds off, but I will have them get on the ground and wrestle a goal pad or wrestle a tackle pad for 15 seconds on, 45 seconds off, 20 seconds on, 40 seconds off. And then lastly, main injury prevention. We're looking at strengthening the shoulder girdle and then finding good, strong positioning with the hips within movements. Right. So this is where kind of coach's eye really steps into play and making sure that they're doing force production in a way that honestly biomechanically sound. And that puts them in a good position for success so that we're not compensating somewhere else in our body because our hips and our hamstrings and our power production center isn't doing exactly what we need them to. So that is the rhinos, our type 5 props, hookers, and second rowers. And now we're going to jump into the horses, right? So what makes the horses great, right? These are what I consider mid-ground athletes. And the 2 examples that I use here, I believe are one of the best centers and then one of the best back rowers in the world currently. On the left, you have Damien de Allende from South Africa, the 12. And on the right, you have Hamish Watson, the Scottish 7, right? So what makes these guys great? And to me, again, it goes back to work rate over now 70 to 80 minutes. These guys, you're not going to look to take these guys off because you're using a few of those subs On the props and the second rowers, you may look to take 1 or 2 off, but what makes somebody great is their ability to last 70 to 80 minutes within this, right? Second thing that makes these guys great, dominant at the contact area. Now, looks pretty similar to the type 5 dominance at the contact area, but the types of contact these guys are going to be taking is a lot different than what a type 5 player would do, right? Damien De Allende, he's taking hit ups off of lineouts and he's dominating that contact area there. That's a beautiful blend of footwork, power, and leg drive through contact. Hamish Watson does very similar things from his end of the spectrum. So ultimately, yes, they're dominant at the contact area, but the way that they achieve dominance is through a little bit more of a hybrid approach and a little bit more versatile than what you might see out of the rhinos. That leads into the third point, ability to handle all player types in attack and defense, right? So these guys aren't just going to go out and they're not going to hide themselves and go, oh, I'm going to go hang out on the wing. And they might do that within the structure of what you guys are playing, but ultimately you would rely on these guys and you'd say, all right, I'm comfortable having you tackle the loose head prop, or I'm comfortable having you tackle one of the back 3 members of the other team, right? So being able, letting them be confident in situations like that because they've moved at those speeds, because their body is used to doing those things, is very key for these guys' success. And then lastly, again, going back to this one big constant in the equation, it's durable. We want these guys to be durable. You don't see either of these guys popping up every other week if they're not durable and if they're not out there. So even through all of the work and all of the load that they put themselves through, they're able to bounce back. And even if they get a little, maybe they get a minor sprain, maybe they get a minor strain of something, their body is resilient enough to put them back into a position to produce and play at a very high level right after that. So with these guys, few statistics to consider. And you'll see there's a nice pendulum that we have here, right? So with the rhinos, we're going to be pretty high on collisions and then pretty low on meters. As we start swinging, right, we're going to be, now we're at the horses, we're going to be about split, even. And then as we get to this last group, the cheetahs, it's going to go up where collisions are going to go down, but high intensity meters are going to go up, right? So looking at these guys, the horses, back row and centers, we're looking at 38% of collisions between these two groups combined throughout matches. So a little bit of a drop off. You still have 7% less collisions than what we were looking at with the type 5. But I think the really big thing is now high intensity meters, almost 200 plus extra meters for the back row high intensity sprinting, and then almost 400 extra meters of high intensity sprinting for the centers, right? So what we're looking at here is these guys, they're going to take a beating in the contact area, but they've also got to be able to get around the pitch, which means we need adequate aerobic base. And we also need to look at all of the soft tissue stuff, the hamstrings, the calves, making sure that those are adequately prepared for the workload that they're going to experience, right? Third thing to consider here, 30 to 40 set pieces during the match, which to me looks at 30 to 40 opportunities to win the gain line. Now, 2 different ways to win the gain line, right? In attack, right, we get soft shoulders, we break the gain line, and we get front foot ball. Now, what does that require? We've got to have good footwork. We've got to have exceptional strength to take on the collision. And then we have to have exceptional power and footwork through contact in order to win that collision battle. Conversely, looking on the defensive side, what do we need? A little bit of good footwork in order to put ourselves in a perfect tackle position. And then the really big thing is power and the ability to roll our hips through, right? Achieve some power and then drive them back so that we win the gain line. They get put on the back foot and they've got to start circling around. Right. And then lastly, almost 46% of all injuries sustained by this group, shoulder, knee, soft tissue. If you guys aren't seeing a theme here, rugby players, the big problem areas, obviously, shoulder, knee, soft tissue stuff. So how do we address this in our training, and how do we make sure it's something that we try to mitigate as much as possible and expedite return timetables as much as possible? Lastly, how do we differ, right? Horses, these guys are hybrids. They're going to cover massive amounts of ground, get mixed up in equal number of collisions. So the way that I approach this is, we can have these guys deal with some axial load in the beginning just to prepare the body. So during the first strength block, you might look at hey, I'm going to have my, my horse's back squat for a little bit, just to get them a little used to it, pepper them with that. Right. But then really what I'm looking to do is a healthy balance of bilateral, so 2 feet, and unilateral work, 1 feet. Right. These guys are going to be mixed in terms of contact areas where they're going to have 2 feet in the ground, or sprinting situations and contact areas where they have 1 foot in the ground. So we have to be able to give them the healthy balance of that. Keeping with the healthy balance theme, footwork can be both close quarters and then also introduce some more open field spacing drills. Again, we need them to be pretty darn good at just about everything. So I want to pepper them with all of these things just as we're going through our training blocks and our training regimens. As we get closer in towards the season, I would probably err on the side of doing some more open field spacing drills with tracking, all of those things, just to get them ready for set piece battles. From a energy system standpoint, these guys we want to give them, again, healthy balance of combat conditioning and sprint or anaerobic work and aerobic base work. So this means, we look at some of the combat conditioning items that we would do for the type 5, have them, chucking stuff onto the ground, getting up and off of the ground a lot. And then you also look at what we'll do with the cheetahs, which is going to be some more distance stuff. We want to dose these guys properly and put them right in the happy medium there. And then almost same exact thing as with the rhinos, right? Injury mitigation is going to lean heavily on adequate shoulder girdle and making sure they can find a good position with their hips. A lot of times when you see rugby players, they're going to let their hips come out. They'll get extended in the low back right when contact begins. And that's where you're going to see a lot of the problems come in with low back soreness, with hip issues, with all of these different things. So again, how do we address these biomechanical principles within our training as we're putting our athletes through paces? All right. And lastly, we have our final position group, which to me is the cheetahs. So here you see Richie Mo'unga, fly half for New Zealand, as well as the Crusaders. And then one of the best breakout players this year, Marika Korobete from Australia. He plays on the wing, and to me, he's an absolute savage because he does all of these things right here extremely, extremely well, right? So what makes these cheetahs great? They're low ground, right? So there's not a ton of contact area, right? They're sprinting around a lot. They're making decisions with ball in hand. They're going to drive the game for you. So what do you need them to be good at? Again, work rate over 80 minutes. This is a very different type of work rate than you saw with both the rhinos as well as the horses, right? So this work rate is going to be very aerobic and sprinting heavy. Second to me is open field tackling prowess, right? I want these guys to be able to track. I want them to be able to win that contact battle. And then I want them to be able to get right back up and make a mess out of that breakdown, whatever it's going on. In almost any high level match, you see these big swings happen when there's open field break, turnover at the breakdown in open field. Nobody's there. Now it's open play. And we let these guys do what they do best, which is decision make and drive. Right. So that requires power and change of direction, linear and lateral acceleration. So I want them to excel at all of that stuff. And then the last two things, see a gap, take a gap. Right. These guys, when they see something, they go through it and they put their foot in the ground and they go. Right. So that's acceleration and speed and top speed work to a T. And I bet you if you put most of these guys onto a track, they'd actually be pretty darn good at what they were doing there. And again, last point here, durable. You don't see any of these, again, just with all of these different position groups, you don't see any of these guys come up and do extremely well if they're plagued with injuries, if they're not taking care of their bodies, and if they're not able to decision make and be on the field. Ultimately, all of the work that we do in the weight room and on the field, when it comes to our strength conditioning buildup, it's to create that resilient body so that we can get live minutes, that we can make decisions in game, because ultimately that's how you become a better rugby player. So a few really interesting statistics to consider for this group, right? So our cheetahs, 9s and 10s and back 3. In our Dartmouth Rugby Football Club fall 2021 season, they averaged 7,500 meters during a match. These guys are covering almost like 3 miles of running, 4 miles of running throughout a match, right? So that requires a little bit different approach in terms of how we're going to look at training them, what we're going to be looking to do in order to elicit the adaptation that we want out of them. Second is out of that 7,500, you had 1,000 high intensity meters. That is 1,000 meters where they are moving over 6 meters per second, which is generally the cutoff that they use for sprinting. Right, most people, if they're above 6 meters per second, they're in a sprint. So when you're looking at 1,000 high intensity meters for the sprint, for sprinting, right? That's going to be a lot of demand on both hip flexors, on hamstrings, pretty much on your running mechanics. How well do you keep all of that stuff? It's really, really interesting to see how that breaks down for these guys. On the flip side of that, again, we're looking at that scale. Now we've tipped that scale all the way up in terms of meters and collisions. They only had 86% of collisions, or 86 collisions with 5 people. So really, these guys are averaging maybe 18 collisions a game, so one every 4 minutes or so. They don't need to, we want to make sure they have an adequate shoulder girdle, right? But they don't need to have the same contact prep items that our horses would or that our rhiners would. And then lastly, I think this is very interesting because it also, within that 55% number, it skews pretty heavily towards soft tissue, which screams to me hamstrings, calves, hip flexors, things like that. 55% of all injuries sustained by this group, shoulder, knee, soft tissue related. Right. So as we get into injury prevention with these guys, how to create bulletproof hamstrings, how do we create hip flexors, as well as calves and tendons and ligaments that are going to be able to handle the sprinting load and volume that is required by these guys. And if you ask me, as a strength conditioning professional, I think sprinting load and volume is one of the hardest things to properly dose and maintain, just because of, one, the power output that it requires, the neurological drive that it requires. It's really, sprinting is probably the most energy sapping thing that somebody can do. So with these guys doing as much as they do, and they have to make decisions on field and they have to do it on the fly, we've got to make sure that we put these guys in a good position where they're not gassed because they're sprinting. So now they can use their brain resources to actually make decisions on the rugby field. How do we differ, right? So cheetahs, they're fast and explosive. So that means I'm not going to do too much axial loading with these guys, or really even 2 feet in the ground bilateral work, right? I might even, I've used this example, but I had one player, Mike Weir, who played for me up at Dartmouth. He just got drafted by Old Glory DC, and him and I decided, he plays fly half. We decided that he was only going to really do unilateral work or single leg squatting work, single leg deadlifting work during his preseason build up and going into season. Because for him, it's not terribly important to be able to produce a ton of force with 2 feet in the ground, right? But it is very, very important for him to be able to produce a ton of force with 1 foot in the ground in a sprinting motion, right? So I'm not going to bilaterally load him with a back squat, but I can put him in a goblet squat with a single leg up and see how much load that he can move there, right? Going into the footwork portion of things, it's going to be a lot less close quarters. These guys are generally going to be pretty springy in their steps in the first place. So you can get away from a little bit of that, as that's something they're already very good at. And now let's go into the open field tracking. Let's go into open field cutting and decision making, right? And let's put them in the situations that they're going to be in, where they have to manipulate a defender over a 10 to 15 meter area of space. They do need a healthy balance of combat conditioning and sprint and aerobic work and aerobic base work. I would lean more towards that sprint aerobic base work. The combat conditioning, you can just kind of dose that stuff in, sprinkle it in just a little bit there for them. Again, because as you saw, they only have about maybe 18 collisions a match per person. So making sure that they're adequately prepared for that, so they can get back up, get right back to work, is important. But again, with 7,500 running meters in a match, I want them to be able to go around and get around the park pretty well. Lastly, injury mitigation. This is going to lean heavily on hamstring and hip care. These guys are fast cars, they're Ferraris, and so you want to keep those engines and the hips and the hamstrings really healthy. You want them to be, and again, it just goes back to how much load can these guys tolerate? How much can these guys tolerate, and how do you build that up as you go through your off-season strength conditioning program? So that was reviewing all of the different position groups that we have right here, and really just the way that I look at these position groups through the lens that we use here at Flight of specific adaptations for imposed demands. So as you can see, there's a little bit different demand placed on each of these athletes as they go through the match. Now, this doesn't mean that they're going to have completely different training programs or protocols, but we can play with some knobs and some levers within their training protocols to make sure that we're getting the most bang for their buck in terms of how they're training, and the time that they're utilizing to train. Because it goes back to that we have less time, more resources principle. It's tying all of this together. We need to make sure that we're very efficient with how we train our athletes and with how we go through the athletic prep period with our athletes. Now, that being said, we're going to now move into a very, very general 30,000-foot view of how I go on preparing athletes for both a spring sevens buildup as well as what you might look at with a spring 15s or fall 15 buildup. Now, again, let me just say this is very, very general. So we'll just take a look here. But so spring sevens, in terms of how general structure, right? I want to quickly build an adequate strength base. I would say that it takes 4 weeks to get done. So the month of December, you're building up a strength base, going to pepper them in with some aerobic base work as well. That month of January going into February, I'm going to convert that to power expression, right? So we've built that strength base. Awesome. Might have moved, even if we only move the needle 1 to 2%. Great. Boom. We're exactly where we need to be. Now we go to power expression at the end of that 4 to 6 weeks. So we're talking probably mid-February, late February at this point. Now we're going a little bit heavier field work, combat conditioning proficiency. So in that first 8 to 11 week block, you're looking at 3 times a week in the weight room, 2 times a week of field work. And then conversely, as you get closer to season, we're going 2 to 3 times or 2 times a week in the weight room, 3 to 4 times a week of field sessions. All right. So you see, it's a little bit different than what I would do for a spring or a fall 15s buildup. So spring, fall 15s, I can take my time a little bit more, build an adequate strength base, about 6 to 8 weeks here, and then convert that into power expression. So that would lead me right in basically to the beginning of that spring season. So I'm still getting them moving at velocities that I want to. I'm putting them in positions that I want to, but we can take a little bit more time because the sprinting demand and the demand of 15s is a little bit less harsh than it is for sevens, right? Then you get into your season, during season, 2 times a week in the weight room, same exact thing, and then about 3 field sessions a week. And then lastly, once you get into that off-season transition, I would pretty much just rinse and repeat this strength-based power expression 4 times a week weight room, 1 time a week field work as you build into the season. Once you're about 2 months out from season, then you start going 3 times a week weight room, 2 times a week field work, so on and so forth. So that's all I have for you guys today. If you've watched this remotely, I really appreciate your time and consideration for looking at this with me. This is a really, really important topic to me, and I think it's one that's really going to drive the culture for USA Rugby over the next 5 to 10 years. If you have any questions, or if you were interested in inquiring about the Flight Online Rugby High Performance Training Program, we do teamwork as well as individual work. Please feel free to reach out, and I'd be more than happy to chat with you. All right. Thank you guys so much for your time. If any of you are at New York Sevens, I'll see you tomorrow. Have a great rest of your day, and I hope you have a wonderful weekend.